All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us during your lunch hour for the Compost Made Easy webinar. My name is Megan Waters. I work at the Office of Sustainability at the County of San Mateo. My colleagues Ivana Andrade, also with the office, and Todd Sutton with Waste Sleuth and Associates will both be joining me on the webinar today. Before we dive into our discussion about composting, I want to make sure you're familiar with the GoToWebinar platform. So we're going to go through how to use it really quickly. If you hear my voice, hopefully you've figured out how to use the audio already. You can either use your computer's microphone and speakers, or you can call into the webinar to access the audio portion through your phone. If you are using your phone, please enter your audio pin as shown here with the red circle. That allows us to track your attendance. And at any time, if you have technical issues, please type into the question panel or the chat box, and either Ivana or I can reply to you and assist you with that. During the presentation, you guys are going to be muted so that we can minimize background noise and interruptions to the presentation. We will have 15 minutes at the end to address your questions, so please keep track of your questions until then. To ask a question, you can raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon, and we'll unmute you so you can ask verbally. If you'd prefer not to do that, or if raising your hand doesn't seem to be working, you can type your question into the chat box or the questions pane in your control panel. At some point during the presentation, we'll be taking a short poll. The poll will come up as a pop-up box that will look similar to this one. When it appears, you can go ahead and select one of the answers, and your tally up, and we'll see the results live. At the end of the webinar, we'll also have a very short survey that will launch as soon as we're closed. The feedback that you guys provide for this in the survey really helps us improve our programs, so we hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. All right, now that we know how to navigate GoToWebinar, here's a brief snapshot of what we're going to cover today. We'll be going through introductions of the Office of Sustainability, the Sustainability Academy, and talk a little bit about our speakers, particularly Todd Sutton, who is our guest speaker today. We're going to review why it's good to compost and reasons why we should all do it. And we'll be going over two different ways to compost: commercial composting, but primarily we'll focus on home composting. What is involved in composting? What's the process that the compost undergoes as you put your food scraps and food soiled paper in there? And then we'll talk about what to do with the resulting compost that you make at home. So without further ado, let's get to the good stuff. As you may know, this webinar originates in the County of San Mateo Office of Sustainability. Our office is relatively new at the county. It started in July 2014 with just 2 staff members. After about 3 years, it's grown to a solid 40 staff members who provide programs out of the 4 work groups that you see here: energy and environment, waste reduction, climate change, and livable communities. The Sustainability Academy falls under the climate change and solid waste management or waste reduction work groups. Ivana, could you tell us a bit about what you do with the Sustainability Academy?
Hi, thanks, Megan. So my name is Ivana Andrade, and I'm a colleague of Megan's in the Office of Sustainability, and I oversee a program called the Sustainability Academy, and this is where this webinar is housed, so to speak. The Academy is really a public environmental education program, and we have a number of different course offerings, from webinars like this one, master composter classes, master resource conservation classes, and then different kinds of workshops offered throughout the year on green homes or energy and water conservation. And I do want to emphasize that it is free, and you may have known the Sustainability Academy under its former name, RecycleWorks Volunteer Academy. We have a large community of volunteers that work with in the San Mateo County community. So I already ran through a little bit of this, but the Academy offers a webinar series, 8-week master courses, and 2-hour workshops. And if you have any questions about what these other offerings entail or have ideas on things that you would like to see offered by the Academy, please do reach out to me. My contact information is listed at the end of the presentation. And these are the people that make the Academy go. Our program manager, her name is Hillary Pappendick. She's the work group manager for the climate change group. My name is Ivana, and then my colleague Jackie is our volunteer coordinator. I'll turn it back to Megan, who will introduce Todd, and we'll start talking more specifically about compost.
All right, thank you, Ivana. Folks, we are lucky to have Todd with us today. He's an expert in the environmental field. He's been around for about 26 years working in sustainability, looking at issues from anything from waste reduction education to construction materials recycling. He does hazardous waste management, so thinking of home items like paint thinner or batteries, and he's even dabbled in water and energy conservation. He's written and produced numerous reuse and recycling guides and has developed online recycling databases to help people like you and me identify where to recycle our one-off items like mattresses or appliances. In the past few years, he even co-produced educational videos on recycling and worked as an on-air TV correspondent for the History and Discovery channels. Wow, Todd, it sounds like you've done it all. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about one of your passions, which is composting. So, Todd, why should we compost?
Well, let me first thank you, Megan and Ivana, for coordinating this webinar. It's really nice to be able to share my passion, as you point out. One of them is composting. It was one of the first things I started doing when I entered the environmental field, as you point out, 26 years ago. I taught backyard composting workshops and went through a master composter program. And it's really interesting now, 26 years later, organics is kind of the new frontier yet. It's been around for a while, but we're starting to see it in terms of its value as far as climate change issues. It's not just to make your tomatoes sweeter. Climate change gases are part of our conversation in terms of sustainability. So why compost? Well, for me, I find it interesting in many different ways. If an individual is kind of into science or biology, compost has that facet to it. If you're interested in gardening, of course, compost is a key component for successful gardening. If you're interested in environmental issues, compost plays a key role in achieving those goals, and we'll talk about some percentages as it relates to the waste stream as we move through this workshop. But I find it just a really cool thing to do, and I talk amongst my friends, and we think of it as like a kind of like an entry drug to the environmental field. Once you start composting, it changes how you look at everything else. For example, when you have a banana peel, you don't just throw it away anymore. You save it until you can put it into a composting system or into a green cart somewhere. It changes how you understand the material world, in my opinion. So that's kind of, I could continue on why compost is great, but we'll just leave it as that for a moment. I've touched on some of the benefits in terms of energy and water and climate change. Compost, again, plays a critical role. Compost has what's known as tremendous water holding capacity. 10 pounds of compost can hold upwards of 80 to 100 pounds of water. What that means is when one incorporates compost into the soil, It's going to retain moisture. And what that means is when we're dealing with water conservation and drought issues, the incorporation of compost into the soil plays a crucial role in terms of water conservation. It also helps to minimize soil erosion, and when organic material composts in the presence of air, it does no harm. But when organics are landfilled and rot in the absence of air, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, it produces methane gas, which is an environmental climate change gas. So backyard composting and regional composting play a critical role in our efforts for sustainability and positive climate practices. There you go.
Great. Yeah, I can't emphasize enough how important it is, especially in our county, well, anywhere, to compost. What you're seeing here is Ox Mountain Landfill, which is located by Lemos Farm, right off of Route 92 on your way to Half Moon Bay. It's owned by Republic Services and has been a landfill since 1993. Republic has a permit to use 191 acres as landfill, and they've used 150. That means there's just 48 acres left to fill with all of our various waste. As we'll see soon, some of that waste is items or materials that could be composted or recycled. They expect that the landfill will last about 25 more years at the rate that we're currently dumping waste into it. So this is where you guys come in. We want to see what you know or want to hear what you guess. How much organic waste do you think goes into the landfill at Ox Mountain? This is where we're going to launch our live poll. If you don't see it, please chat us.
Oh wait, I have to select it. Here we go. Launch.
Okay, the poll should be open.
So when you get a chance, oh, there we go, getting some folks responding. That's great. Thank you. So it looks like most people think that, great, everybody's voted. Thank you. What do you think, Megan?
This is great. All right, closing the poll.
Oh, wait, most people think 80%.
Oh yeah, most people, it looks like most people think that 35 to 40% of what goes into the landfill is organic material. Todd, what do you say?
Well, I'm impressed with the results of that poll, because that's pretty close. It depends on the area, but the answer is a little bit more. It's the grand total of all organics in San Mateo County is just under 57%. And of that 57%, well, of the whole waste stream, 27% is food. So this particular slide is one of my favorite slides when I talk with folks about environmental issues, climate change, organics, composting, et cetera. I use it in various workshops. And I always start by asking people, before I show this slide, I always say, hey, everybody raise your hand if you recycle. And of course, everybody in the audience raises their hand. And if I ask you that right now, invisibly, everybody raise your hand if you recycle, then you would. But then I say, well, this image here is a cross-section of a garbage can, not a recycling bin. And if you note, about 25%, the lower numbers on that image there, are really common things: glass, paper, metal, plastic. And it adds up to about 23, 24%. And the idea that still such basic things as newspaper and office paper represent 8% of our waste stream is kind of frustrating. But that's not the point here in this workshop or this discussion. It's that a large percentage of what is in our waste stream is food. and a high percentage of that food is edible. And when we pay attention to headlines and we hear about hunger and starvation and homelessness and food shelters and all these places, and then you realize that a high percentage, the UN estimates, United Nations estimates that 1/3 of all food is uneaten and thrown away. So the data points on this issue alone are impressive and heart-wrenching to a certain degree. But the bottom line here is, because of these numbers, this 57% organics, compost plays a huge role in diverting that material, that 57%, away from that garbage can there and into your backyard in a compost bin or into a green cart and off to a regional composting facility. So there's the answer. Okay.
Thank you. So
long answer, but go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just going to continue.
Well, this is a cross-section, almost cartoon imagery of what happens to organics when it goes to the landfill. So you've got your truck there, and we bury our organics, and you see the green arrows going up. When organic material is buried, it tends to be buried in, there's no or minimal air. When organic materials, banana peels, food scraps, leaves, etc., when organic material is buried and decays or rots in the absence of air, it produces methane gas, which is 20 to 100 times more potent than CO2, which we talk about all the time. So not only does it produce methane gas, but as it breaks down, it also produces something that's called leachate that tends towards our groundwater and becomes a contaminant. So organic matter in the landfill is a no-no. Often people say, well, isn't it okay? It's going to landfill. It's going to rot there. Well, it is going to rot, but it's not okay. So that's kind of the situation with landfilling. Go ahead.
Right. It does break down, but it produces very harmful outputs. Just to give you an idea, the Ox Mountain Landfill specifically collects about 20,000 to 30,000 gallons a day of leachate, and it has to be treated before it's released. So not an easy task. Something else we need to be aware of is that we have unintended litterers. If you look at this picture, you can see a bunch of seagulls flying around. They produce litter. They are attracted by your peanut butter and jelly sandwich. They'll go in, they'll pick it up, they'll get bored with it and drop it off at the beach, drop it in the forest there, drop it anywhere. So to minimize this, Republic Services, which owns the landfill, they spend about $17,000 a month just to keep the seagulls off the landfill to try to prevent and minimize the litter. So to do that, they use predatory birds like hawks or falcons to scare them away. I've heard of other landfills using dogs or spray guns. So in addition to the methane and the leachate, we've also got this litter problem. But the good news is, as Todd has been saying, we can combat this, all of this, and even social justice issues by taking part in composting. So what you see here is a generic map. If you're interested in knowing more about your particular hauler, waste hauler, you can contact us. In some areas in the county, like the orange cities here, they are serviced by Recology, and everyone in those service areas should have access to 3 bins. So if you're in one of those areas, really easy to compost commercially, which is when the hauler picks up all of your organic material from that green bin. They ship it all the way out of our county because we don't have a commercial composting facility here. They ship it all the way to Tracy and sometimes even further. So while it is composting, it's not the best. composting, it's not as good as composting at home because you have all of the emissions from the transportation of the material. And then once it's turned into compost, then there's the shipping cost of bringing it back to us. So really one of the great things about composting in your own backyard, that's a commercial composting facility here. They have windrows and they turn it over. One of the benefits of composting at home is that you have access to the compost right when it's ready for you, and there aren't any emissions costs associated with it. Todd's going to go over a bit about the different types of home composting methods that you can choose from, and he has a lot more experience with composting than I do, so he can provide some recommendations in which situations to use each method.
Thanks, Megan. Excellent points on commercial or curbside collection of organics and the environmental costs associated with that versus a much more benign, fewer outputs in terms of emissions by the practice of backyard composting. So there are many different ways to compost. And I remind folks that the microorganisms that make compost happen don't know that they're in a compost bin or in a pile or in a bucket or a barrel or whatever. So that really doesn't impact the process as much as the good ingredients. But choosing a good system does help you, the human, in terms of being able to easily turn the compost pile and be more successful in terms of the quality of the material you produce and the handling issues. My all-time favorite compost system is a simple wire hoop, and that's shown there in the upper left corner or in that image right there. The recipe for a wire hoop is 10 feet long by 36 inches wide of wire. And there's all kinds of different wire out there. I definitely do not recommend chicken wire. It's too wimpy. But there are all kinds of grades of wire. They come in different price ranges. But if they're selling it at the store for, let's say, $2 a linear foot, you get 10 feet of it. It's $20 for a wire hoop. So it's very affordable. It has tremendous capacity. This image here is even kind of narrow. A full 10-inch wire hoop is a little bit wider than those shown in that image. Go ahead, next. Here's a classic example of a plastic commercial composting bin. This is an excellent product. Many municipalities throughout California offer this bin, and it's sometimes found at some of your large retail boxes like Sam's Club or Costco. It's got an excellent locking lid system. There are really, as I stated going in, the compost doesn't know what it's in. So if you find a good bargain on a composting bin, a black plastic bin like this, I highly recommend that. Go ahead. In the past several years, there have been numerous products coming on the market, inexpensive, affordable tumblers or barrel composters. There's all kinds of shapes and sizes. I kind of, buyer beware. Some of them are really good. Some of them are kind of cheap. Some of them are very expensive. Cheap meaning they fall apart and they don't perform as well as the photograph on the box. So I'm not so fond of tumblers. Some people love them. So it's just like anything. It's freedom of choice. Go ahead. A 3-bin system is great if you've got a larger piece of property. It contains a lot of material, and it also allows one of those bays, one of the 3 areas there, to be used as a final storage for some of the finished compost to allow it to mature and allow for easy access for gardening use or home plants, etc. This system right here, one would use 2 of those bays and would turn it back and forth between 2 bays, and then ultimately the final bay would be for storage, as I stated.
Hey, Todd.
Yes.
Looking at this picture, if I have a hard time bending over, is that can that be accommodated with this system?
Yeah, this particular system's fairly clever. They're using, if you look carefully, the front boards are deposited or kept in place by some little grooves. So each of those boards can be lifted out. So ultimately, let's say there's 4 boards on each of those bays. You lift out 4 of each, and then you can use your pitchfork and shovel to access the piles from the front end. So that's a really, and then when you're done, you put the boards back in, and it keeps the material in place.
That sounds
pretty
great.
Clever system. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a pit and trench system. It's as old as mankind. You're out in your garden, you dig a hole, you throw your garden waste into the pit, and you cover it back up. And it's a classic gardening technique. One word of caution is, depending on what type of food scraps you're putting in that pit, you definitely want to make sure that it's covered up well. The downside, again, is critters, raccoons or dogs, maybe rats, can get into there much more easily than in a confined system like a wire hoop or one of those plastic commercial bins. So although it works, of all the methods, this is one I tend not to recommend, just for kind of public hygiene reasons alone. Okay.
Great, good point.
And then a different system for composting, but excellent for food scraps, and certainly excellent for folks that don't have yards, but of course we all eat and therefore have some food scraps during our daily lives. Worm composting is the answer. It can be done in small plastic tubs like shown in the upper left, homemade wooden boxes. They're common in schools. Teachers and students maintain a worm box and take the finished casts and grow vegetables on campus. I just think it's a great system. It's a little bit different. I always equate it using cooking as an analogy. Backyard composting is larger volume. It's like barbecuing, and a worm box is much smaller. It's kind of like baking some bread. They're both composting, but completely different techniques. Backyard composting can get warm or hot, and a worm composting box, you want to keep it cool. So each of these methods, require some understanding, but very excellent ways of dealing with organic composting options. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So we're going to move into the basic process of backyard composting. I'll give an overview of the process, the big 4, which we'll get into, and then some troubleshooting comments and techniques. Go ahead. So I touched on this earlier, but compost happens through the activity of what we commonly refer to as the FBI: fungus, bacteria, and insects and invertebrates. And a great majority, upwards of 2/3 or more, of the decomposition or decay or rot happens through bacteria, things that you can barely see with your naked eye. In fact, you really can't see it. There are funguses and molds that will take place or show up in a mature compost system, and you will also see critters, the macroorganisms, native earthworms, sow bugs, ants, roly-polies, centipedes, millipedes. A whole zoo of critters will show up into an active composting program. And in many cases, particularly in the form of the funguses and the bacteria, and some of the bugs are eating the waste product of other critters. So there's a lot of eating and wasting going on inside. And over a period of time, things that you recognize, your banana peel and your leaves and your grass, will slowly be broken down through the activity of the bacteria, the microorganisms, and be converted from something you recognize into a black, rich, crumbly material called humus or compost. Good. Mm. What do they need to survive? Well, much of what the FBI require for their ongoing survival and general happiness is the same thing that we need: air, food, water, and shelter. So show me the next slide there. There we have. So these are what we call the big four: the browns, the greens, the air, and the water. And I mentioned shelter. In this case, shelter would be a composting bin, a wire hoop or something, a well-constructed pile, and the incorporation of water keeps the microorganisms very happy. And they live off of all of our leaves and grass and twigs and pine needles and all of our food scraps out of the kitchen. So the browns, again, leaves, twigs, pine needles, sawdust, things like that. And the greens, grass, food scraps, manures, and then we're doing it on the planet Earth here. So we've got air, and a lot of the ingredients that we're incorporating, particularly on the green side, are high in moisture. And then as one constructs the pile, you incorporate water with a hose. Go ahead.
Todd, I've heard some people using newspaper for their browns. What do you think about that?
Well, I think newspaper is a great ingredient for worm composting, for worm boxes. In fact, it's a primary ingredient. Shredded newspaper is what's referred to as the bedding for earthworms. But when it comes to traditional backyard composting bins, I believe in this concept of the highest and best use. And the highest and best use for newspaper is to have newspaper recycled back into more paper. Now, that said, if newspaper is damp or soiled for some reason, then it's an appropriate ingredient for a backyard compost bin. But as a source, as a go-to source for your carbon or brown-rich material, I don't recommend it. I think it should be recycled. Okay,
thank you.
So here's a very short list of browns and greens, and roughly by volume, not by weight, it's about 50-50. You want, generally speaking, more brown stuff than green stuff in your compost pile. And the reason for that is the green stuff, leaves, food scraps, tend to be high in moisture, and when one has large quantities of that material in a composting system, it tends to go sour or smelly. So it's always important to balance out your green stuff with brown stuff, meaning mix your food scraps and your grass clippings with a lot of leaves and branches and high carbon or brown materials. I find that it's easier to talk about, go ahead, that was fine. It's easier to talk about what not to put in the compost pile than to discuss all the true possibilities of what can go in the compost pile. So the idea is that one is only putting organic stuff in a compost pile, so we're not going to talk about not putting plastic and soda and beer cans and all that into a composting system. So if you look at this list, everything on this list is organic, but if you incorporate them into a composting system, you're going to have problems of a different sort. Generally, and specifically rather, it's highly recommended never to incorporate fecal matter from meat eaters, so cats, dogs, lions, tigers, that sort of thing. So no animal that eats meat should one put their waste in. Now, chicken manure and horse and cattle and all that sort of stuff is fine. Even the manures from caged pets, hamsters, etc., rabbits, that's all fine, but nothing from a meat eater. The general statement is no meats or dairy products should go into a backyard compost pile, and the reason for that is they're referred to as putrescent. They get smelly and rank. Cheese and sour cream and fat, they become very, very smelly and attractive, and that would then attract things like flies and rats, which are considered a health concern, rightly so. And then lastly, weeds and infected plants, and not all weeds, specifically weeds like star thistle and nettles, or even something that would be not considered a weed, a rose, thorns, so things that will harm you physically when you interact with the compost. The idea is you're actually going to touch the stuff with your hands when you're gardening and such. And then infected plants, if you have some sort of a blight or mildew, check with your regional master gardener office or a nursery person at your local nursery to talk about your specific infestation. Though you may perpetuate the problem if you incorporate some sort of infection into your backyard compost. Those are general guidelines. So as you see, there's only a few general things that you want to keep out of your compost pile. That leaves the whole universe of everything else. So we can entertain questions on that. Building your pile, basically, you take what you have over, let's say you mowed the lawn and raked up some leaves. You take what you have and you layer it. You layer some of the brown stuff and you layer some of the green stuff, meaning layer leaves and then layer some grass and then layer some leaves, bury your food scraps. You always want to end or finish your layering with a brown layer. And the reason for that is if you you finish with a layer of green and it's fresh grass or it's food scraps, those tend to be smelly or odoriferous and attract houseflies and other critters that you don't want. So you always want to layer it, but finish with a brown layer, which is leaves or pine needles or something like that.
So
that's just kind of
you said we could use whatever we find. Often I have some eggshells left over. You didn't mention that, but it's a common household item. Is it considered meat?
No, that's a great question, and I did miss that. I should always have a little asterisk on the word dairy, because dairy, everything but the eggshell. Eggs, kind of grandma's old gardening recipe is coffee grounds and eggshells make for really happy gardens because the worms love it. So the answer is eggshells are a perfectly acceptable and desired ingredient for a backyard compost pile. So save those eggshells, put your coffee grounds in there. Coffee grounds are generally considered a nitrogen. They're very high in nitrogen and they're high in moisture. So you want to treat those as a green material.
Okay, great news. I go through like 2 dozen a week.
No, good. Yeah, perfect place for them. Now, troubleshooting. There's basically when you're turning your pile, and you use a pitchfork to do that, a spade fork. When you're turning your pile or interacting with your composting system, just kind of use your eyes and your fingers and your nose, because you'll be able to figure things out. I mean, if the pile is wet, you can tell, because visually you'll see that it's damp. You can get that by touching it. That just tells you everything's fine. You need moisture. Things do not rot without sufficient moisture or water. If the pile looks dry, it is dry. Add water. A pile will stall with insufficient moisture. In most cases, my years of experience, including my own practice, I find that most people rarely have a high moist pile. In other words, most people rarely water their pile enough. So high moisture is your key to success. It keeps the microorganisms active. Other things for troubleshooting would be odor. Again, odor is going to come off of your food scraps and high nitrogen content materials. Grass clippings are another one of those. So the way to handle that is to turn the pile, incorporate the smelly elements into the rest of the pile that has other carbon-rich material, leaves and pine needles, etc. Stir it up, turn the pile, will help to knock away or reduce the odor that may be coming off the pile. What other troubleshooting questions do you have?
I think that pretty much covers it.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't think of any. If you have questions, listeners, please go ahead and type into the chat box. We will save most of the questions till the end, but I see that someone asked a relevant question. How often do you need to turn the pile?
That's a great question. I recommend 1 to 2 times a month. If one is willing to turn a pile 1 to 2 times a month, you will have finished compost in 3 to 5 months. Now that's kind of a vague answer, a vague range, but it depends on the ingredients that your pile is comprised of. What do you make it with? In other words, is it high in leaves? Is it all nitrogen? And then if you're turning your pile twice a month, then you're going to increase the process by blending it more often, you make compost faster. But here's the one thing that I always say, and I haven't said it till right now. No matter what you do, you're going to be successful with a compost pile, because the ultimate law of the organic world of nature is everything organic rots, period. Everything organic rots. So if you bring leaves and grass and food scraps together, it is going to rot. You can't stop it from happening. But with some proper techniques and frequent turning, you will be able to make really premium compost in a fairly reasonable amount of time with minimal bad odors or other kind of, we'll call, side effects. So there's my answer.
So how do you know when it's done?
Well, that's a great question. It's kind of a vague answer. Again, you'll know it when you see it. You realize that for a few months you've been incorporating leaves that you recognize as a leaf, and pine needles and banana peels and dozens of eggshells and coffee grounds and avocado skins and all the things that come out of our kitchen and we rake up in our yard, and you recognize them for what they are. And over a few months, those items, those things break down, they decompose, they disintegrate, and they become crumbly, rich, black stuff called compost. And when you can't recognize a majority of the pile, you're getting there. And you'll want to use what I mentioned earlier, a spade fork. It usually has 4 or 5 tines, a special kind of tool, and they're very common. And when one is turning the compost pile and a majority of the stuff does not stay on the pitchfork, it tells you that it's done. In other words, when you're turning the pile and you can't hardly turn it with the pitchfork, you need a flat edge shovel, you've got compost.
So this may seem redundant, but what can I do, or what can we do when we have finished compost?
Well, it's not necessarily redundant. That's a great question. So what do you do with the stuff? Well, the most common thing is if you have a backyard garden or any kind of backyard vegetation, people go out and they buy bags of compost and they rototill it in or they shovel it in. So screening out your compost is highly recommended, and I do that with basically a rectangular plastic milk crate. You can find those types of products at your drugstores like Target and Walmart, and all those big chains have plastic crates that have kind of a mesh bottom on them, and you take 1 or 2 shovelfuls and shake that material through that screen. Whatever stays in the screen is called the overs. That goes back into your compost system. Whatever comes through the crate is finished compost, and you can put that in your soil. You can put it in your vegetable garden. You can soft rake it onto your lawn. You can put it around your trees and your rose bushes. There's countless ways to use your finished compost. You can take your finished compost and blend it with a bag of potting soil and make your own homemade blend for your house plants. You can repot all your house plants and revitalize them with fresh homemade compost.
Todd, this is Ivana, and I know that in the past when I've learned about the application of compost, I've been really surprised at how much it helps the productivity and health of the plants that are growing in that area. I was hoping maybe you could speak a little bit more specifically to that, what you've noticed in your experience applying compost.
Well, yes, I can. Thanks, Ivana. Good question. Absolutely. The application as a mulch or the incorporation into the soil of organic matter, compost, is fantastic. It's somewhat magical. You have to kind of imagine what the soil is. It's over eons, rock and sand and the inorganic elements break down and become kind of the gritty components of soil or dirt. And organic matter, leaves and plants and other things die and rot and eventually incorporate their organic constituents into the soil. And it's that organic component of the inorganic soil. It's kind of like, I look at the grit as something the roots of a plant stand on, and the organic stuff, the compost, as the food and nutrient source that the roots get their energy and vitality from. So when one takes finished compost and applies it onto the soil, not only are you getting the decayed organic matter, but you're also getting a lot of microorganisms that are alive and vital, and earthworms and other critters and microorganisms that are part of the web of the soil, the life of the soil. And plants just thrive on that. Not to mention the incorporation, as I mentioned, the incorporation of organic matter into the soil helps for moisture or water retention, which is certainly something that plants are looking for their own continuous hydration. So it's just, I can't say enough of it about how easy it is to do and how powerful it is to mulch your plants with homemade organic matter.
Great, thanks, Todd. So folks, we'll take questions now. If you could type those into the question box or the chat box, we'll start reading them out. So Todd, if you want to raise your hand and ask verbally, you may go ahead and do that also. I'll give you a couple minutes to get those questions in.
Well, I'll just comment, I see that one, how often do you turn the pile? Again, it's not necessary. I mentioned earlier, everything organic rots, so even if you don't turn the pile, it's going to happen. Frequent turning just means you'll have compost sooner. And one of the nice things is, we go through the seasons of the year. In the wintertime, it's cold. Tomorrow, it's going to be rainy. You don't necessarily need to get out there and turn the compost pile. It's still going to rot. That's another point. If you have a commercial bin with a lid, during the rainy season, take the lid off and let the rain in. So that's kind of a good tip. Can you compost eggshells? Yes, we talked about that. Do bones count as meat? No. There is such a thing as bone meal. Most of us have heard about that. It's rather expensive if you go and buy a box of that material. It's not. That's kind of a treading the line. The party line is no meats, no fats, no dairy products, is what every community says in their backyard composting workshops. And that's because we don't want to tell people, oh, it's okay, and then you have some housefly infestation or rat infestation, something negative in your neighbor's backyard. You don't want your neighbor to be a bad actor. Things like bone, let's say you made some chicken soup or something and you cook the heck out of the bones and you've just got bones, you can put that in there. It's just a fairly benign material, and over time it will break down, particularly things like chicken bone. They break down easily and will become that bone meal in the soil. So it is a very positive ingredient to incorporate into the soil, but you want to be careful that it doesn't have fresh meat on it. Is kind of my long answer to that.
Another question that popped to mind is, what in your experience has been the biggest barrier for people to start their own backyard bins or their own worm bins? And I'm asking that because a lot of times when we get folks attending these webinars and workshops and classes about compost, they end up wanting to tell other people about it. And sometimes in communicating about compost, it's really helpful to know what people's first and primary reservations to doing it are.
Well, that's a great question. And when I do my longer 2-hour workshop, one of the beginning of the workshop, I talk about the myths associated with the practice of backyard composting, and I state the myths, and then I kind of debunk them. And it's my feeling that if those myths aren't debunked or shot and killed, so to speak, people hold on to those in their head, and the thought bubble is, he hasn't killed my myth, so I'm holding on to it. And the myth is like, compost is hard work, or it smells, or it's complicated. And it doesn't have to be hard work. You can gather your leaves and grass and just let them hang out in a wire hoop, and it'll break down if you never do anything else other than that. it'll break down. Now, if you want to turn your compost pile every 3 days, well, that takes some physical effort and that's some work, but it doesn't have to be that. As far as complication, you can study the science of backyard compost and understand carbon and nitrogen ratios and all the microorganisms and the different temperature thresholds at the biology of the system. But whether you know that or not, as I said, everything organic rots. It doesn't matter if you know how it works or not. It's going to happen, so it's not complicated. And as far as odor, I would say that's a true myth that compost smells, but it only smells because we're being bad actors. We're constructing the pile incorrectly, or we're being lazy, meaning we're leaving green stuff on top of the pile, fresh grass and food scraps on top of the pile, which are going to be smelly and create a negative situation. So simply burying those materials into the pile and always finishing with a brown layer of leaves addresses that odor issue. So I would say, to get back to your question, the emphasis that composting is easy, because it is. It's actually easier to compost and understand it than trying to understand all the different forms of plastic and containers that you put in your recycling bin. And by the way, that's not as complicated as operating your smartphone. So I don't buy anybody saying it's too complicated and they don't understand how it all works. But back to the point, composting is easy. I would say that some of the myths that perpetuate in the urban legends out there need to be called out and addressed directly, and reminding folks that composting is easy and the benefits are many and are wonderful in terms of an individual practicing local backyard home sustainability practices.
Great. Thanks, Todd.
Along those lines, I've noticed that a couple of our attendees have done the Master Compost course through the Sustainability Academy, and one of the expectations is that they spread the good news about composting to their neighbors. So what kind of messaging would you use, or could they use in conversations with their neighbors to kind of entice them or convince them to also compost?
Good question. That's kind of what's the silver bullet? I don't have one yet. I'm looking for it, but I guess it's important to make sure that you are sound in your technical knowledge of compost and not to make anything up, and to tell folks again how easy it is to do, and to tell stories about your process, your compost bin, your system, or invite them over, or ask them have they ever tried it before. So ask questions to kind of get the conversation going, rather than you should do this. Kind of start it with, I'm doing this, it's easy, and boy, here's some tomatoes or something like that. Kind of come at it from a side angle. Or if there's a conversation about climate change or anything like that, that's kind of a conversation opener for how important composting is and keeping organics out of the landfill, and how one can really get a grand slam by having the practice of backyard composting done at home, how that's truly the best option. And then they say, well, I've got my cart. Well, I said, well, it's kind of a win-win for those. Let's say you have a tree and a limb breaks in a windstorm and you don't have any equipment to break down, grind up a branch or something. Well, you can put the branch in your compost cart, but everything else you can put in your backyard compost bin. So there's kind of a hybrid approach to it. I guess it's a matter of thinking about the different answers that you need to have in your quiver, and sharing your enthusiasm, and convincing people that they can do it, that it's not complicated, that it's easy.
Well, thank you so much, Todd, for answering all of our questions. Thanks to everyone who sent in their questions. We are going to be having some home composting workshops coming up in the next 2 months. As you can see here, we're going to have one in Foster City. They tend to last 2 hours, I believe. Todd, you're doing that one?
Yes.
And then there's one in April in South City. Also 2 hours from 10 to noon on a Saturday. If you do have any other questions, please feel free to call our hotline or contact Ivana and the Sustainability Academy at the number you see here.
Great. Well, thanks again, Todd. Really appreciate your expertise. Listening to you talk about compost is always really interesting. So, yeah, I look forward to seeing you at the next compost workshop. And thanks all for attending. I'll wrap up the webinar now. And again, if you do have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to call or email me at aandrade@smcgov.org. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care, Todd. Bye.
Bye-bye.